I'm thinking of a teenager that I work with who is oversensitive to tactile sensation and struggles with hair washing, hair brushing. But he's a really good rugby player and he gets in the scrum. He's also tends to be over responsive to noise, but he's into heavy rock and he goes to gigs. And I think for him, when he goes to a rock concert, it's entirely predictable what's going to be happening.
Back in the day, when I was a bit more social, I would like to go to clubs and dance. And that would be okay because I knew the social norms and rules of that particular environment. Now, if somebody had driven past me on a quiet street with a loud motorbike, or a siren had gone off or an alarm had gone off, it would have sent me into extreme anxiety.
This is the Autism Central podcast for parents and carers of autistic people. We bring together autistic people, parents, carers and professionals to talk about different aspects of autism. Autism Central is a peer education programme commissioned by NHS England. It aims to build knowledge and understanding of autism and to empower families and carers to advocate for autistic people they support. Some of our podcast episodes contain specialist terms you may be unfamiliar with. We've put together a glossary to explain some of the terms mentioned. Please follow the link in our show notes to access this.
Hi, I'm Holly Sprake-Hill, a neurodivergent specialist occupational therapist and a late diagnosed autistic and ADHD person. I'm delighted to be the host of this first series of the Autism Central podcast. This series is all about autism and sensory processing, an area where many autistic people experience differences. In the next few episodes, I will be talking to autistic people, parents and professionals who will be sharing their insights on sensory processing differences, as well as tips and strategies for support. In this first episode, we'll be joined by my colleague and friend Denise Martin, who is also an occupational therapist and specialist in sensory processing differences. Welcome, Denise. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Hi, Holly. So I'm an occupational therapist and I'm lucky enough to work with autistic teenagers. And my role really is to support high schools to understand, accept and make adjustments for their sensory processing needs.
So to start us off with, could you explain what sensory differences actually are?
So when we're talking about sensory processing, we're really referring to how the brain filters, organises, responds to sensory information. And that sensory information is from the environment, via our external senses, but actually also from our internal senses, so the sensations that we're receiving from our body. But I think it's also quite important to distinguish that from sensory impairment. Would you like me to say a bit about that difference?
Oh, definitely. Yes, please.
I think it's important to acknowledge that this isn't a loss of function. So this is not the same as perhaps being partially sighted or blind, where there may be a loss of function and the sensory information is not being received or not being received entirely. This is a difficulty with processing that information and filtering and also responding to it.
So we're thinking like a traffic jam or like a sieve that's got blocked, like you've got too much pasta in your sieve and you can't get all the water out. That kind of, there's too much in and you can't get things to drain through.
Oh, I love that analogy. I think the thing that's really important and pretty much key, I think, is the issue of under response and over response. I find it quite simple to think of it in those terms. And as you said at the beginning, we all have differences in terms of whether we under or over respond, whether we're oversensitive to sensory information. But I guess the difference for an autistic person is that that's going to just be much more so. And also they may have more difficulty in getting that need met.
So that is really, really interesting, isn't it? And one of the things that I find incredibly fascinating is that we often always know about the really obvious senses, don't we? So people talk about sight, they talk about hearing, taste, touch, and then when it comes to autism, there's these big words that get thrown in there: proprioception and interoception and vestibular, and they can be really confusing for parents, can't they? And really confusing for autistic people generally. Can you explain a little bit about those more less heard or less known senses? Just sort of as basically as you can, like, I don't know, the quick guide to the lesser known ones.
Absolutely. So in terms of vestibular, spelt with a V, it's, our vestibular senses are sense of movement, but specifically balance. And our proprioceptive sense is the information that we get from our joints and muscles telling us, I mean, that specifically is where we are in space, it's about our body awareness. But I also think it's important not to get too mechanical about these, because in reality, when we're moving, we're not using these senses in isolation. You know, we're using our vestibular and our proprioception and our vision and our tactile, all together.
Yeah.
But I think for parents, having awareness of all sort of 5 external and the 3 internal, if you include interoception in this, I think gives a good kind of structure for just making sure we're thinking through the senses, because otherwise we can end up forgetting to kind of consider things like smell, because particularly as adults, our sense of smell, not for everybody, but it tends to decline, and we can really just sort of not acknowledge and not consider senses. We can sort of just forget, just kind of leave them off the list. So I do think it's important not to be too mechanical in trying to separate them out, but also being very aware of them all and kind of considering them all.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of human nature, isn't it, to want to understand each one and put it in a little sort of metaphorical box and go, right, I understand the impact of things being too bright or too noisy or too smelly and how that might affect my child. But actually human beings aren't like that, are they? They're complicated, and things don't usually happen in isolation. And I suppose, how might that look in a school day for somebody? How might it impact on what happens to an autistic child in a school day?
I think that's so good to just dive straight into an example. So I think for a young person arriving at school, it's important to consider what's happened before school as well. And perhaps putting on school uniform is, there's a multitude of sensory factors that come into play. But if we just try and pick out some obvious ones, perhaps getting into school uniform, tolerating school uniform may already be something, because that's a tactile sensation, right? So that's something, and actually, if you're overreactive, oversensitive to tactile sensation, that can be a really intense experience, and that might be labels, or it might be seams, or it might be blazers, or it might be tucking in shirts. So that may already be something that somebody's dealing with.
Especially if you're a bit anxious as well, and you're already feeling a bit worried.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because that will just heighten things, which is not to say that sensory processing is anxiety, because it isn't. It is not the same thing. It's not synonymous with anxiety. However, anxiety will take some of the person's resources and will heighten the sensory experience. So it is kind of a bidirectional relationship, because actually also that sensory discomfort will also make them feel more anxious. So it kind of works both ways. So just kind of acknowledging that actually before you even arrive at school, you've had to have your breakfast, for example. That may involve tolerating different textures of food in your mouth. You perhaps tolerating different sort of self-care activities that might be difficult for you, like brushing your teeth or washing your hair. tolerating also other people doing things in the house, because mornings can be quite chaotic and quite noisy in the household. And then you arrive at school, and if you're somebody who struggles with perhaps, let's say, auditory sensation, you tend to be over-responsive, and you're also struggling with light touch, and then you have to sit in a school assembly where, let's say in primary school, where typically they're sitting in rows, cross-legged. That can be quite overwhelming in terms of when there are clapping, or there's the noise of people getting into position, the proximity of other people around you. Visually, there's a lot going on too. It's not just the things that are happening in the classroom, but also all the things that are happening outside of the classroom as well, such as moving from different areas of the school, particularly in high school, of course. You know, the corridor traffic is immense. You've also got the toilets. I mean, smells in schools is a whole topic.
Absolutely.
In primary schools, yes, in primary schools, the lunch smells come on from about 10:30 in the morning. Those can be quite intense. The toilet smell can also be really intense. And actually, as we were sort of saying, I think smell is one that often does go missed, actually, for pupils, because they assume that everybody smells the same, has the same reaction and response to smell as they do. But actually, if you're very hypersensitive to smell, you may be able to smell the coffee that the teacher had maybe 2 or 3 hours ago. And that can be really difficult for you to filter and make it difficult to concentrate. And if you also struggle with noise and start to feel distressed, you know, in terms of the example that we're giving here, that can also be misinterpreted by other people. And it can be assumed that that distress is some kind of willful behaviour. And then you could see how things could quickly spiral.
Absolutely. So what I'm hearing is it's such a complicated environmental picture that involves the whole day and the whole of that person's life. It's not just individual senses at maybe a couple of times in the day. It's the whole day, the whole person's environment, based on every single thing that comes into that person's life. So it's not just simply understood by going, oh yeah, it's just smells or it's just sound. It's much more complicated than that. It's much more nuanced than that.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think very often we do notice children who tend to have quite an active response to sensation. So an active response might be that they will try and get away from the sensation that they find uncomfortable. And we would talk about sensory avoiders, and people will be readily able to kind of spot that. You know, they'll talk about sensory avoiders, and they may notice that somebody has a fight or flight response. And obviously, we're also acknowledging that that's very often misinterpreted as willful behaviour, which takes you to a whole other level of difficulty for that young person. But there is also the other side, which is when somebody has not an active response, but a passive response to that. And so they may be experiencing the same level of distress, but it may not be as obvious to the observer, even the person that's, you know, trying to support their sensory needs. And that can be look as though somebody's frozen.
Right, yeah.
It's very subtle. It's kind of not the same thing as masking and internalizing, but I think it's very much kind of in that ballpark. And that's really important to observe, because it's important that we're not misinterpreting and treating behaviour as willful or naughty, but also that we're not completely missing it.
Yeah. And can children go through different types of these sensory seeking and avoiding and overwhelm and underwhelm throughout the day and throughout time?
Yes, I love hearing you ask that, Holly, because I know you. I can imagine your answer to me on that. And Very, very much so. When we're thinking of somebody's sensory profile, in inverted commas, it is complicated because it's so contextual. I mean, for various reasons, but contextual. So, as we said at the little bit ago, anything that will kind of deplete somebody's resources or just heighten things for them. So tiredness will deplete someone's resources. Anxiety will heighten things for somebody. That's going to really come into play. If the social demands are high, if the cognitive loading of that activity is high, that can all affect somebody's resources to process sensory information. But then contextually as well, that changes everything.
Oh, so doesn't it?
For an example, yeah, I'm thinking of a teenager that I work with who is very, sometimes people might say tactile defensive, but oversensitive to tactile sensation. So really struggles with that, and struggles with things like hair washing, hair brushing. But he's a really good rugby player and he gets in the scrum. He's also tends to be over responsive to noise and sound, but he's into heavy rock and he goes to gigs. And I think for him, the sensation is very different. When he goes to a rock concert, it's entirely predictable what's going to be happening. I imagine that it kind of makes sense, and I'd be interested to know what you think, Holly, but
Absolutely.
Makes sense to his brain. He wants to be there. But I don't think it's just wanting to be there. I also think the context affects how that sensation is processed by the brain. And to me, that totally makes sense. But I know some people find that counterintuitive. What do you think?
Oh, I mean, for me, I think, especially for autistic people, autistic sensory processing is very much in keeping with the autistic way of seeing the world. So for me personally, back in the day when I was a bit more social, I would like to go to clubs and dance, and that would be okay because I would like that loud music because I knew the social norms and rules of that particular environment. I knew why I was there. I knew what to expect. I knew when it would end. There was a routine involved with that, and I was in control of it. Now, if somebody had driven past me on a quiet street with a loud motorbike, or a siren had gone off or an alarm had gone off, it would have sent me into extreme anxiety. If the bell goes off in a school environment, even now as I work, it makes me feel incredibly anxious. It triggers awful feelings because it is unexpected and it's out of my control. So, like you say about context is huge, and it can be very easily tipped into feeling unpleasant. So what can be okay and controlled one minute can not be okay and controlled, which I think is, for a lot of parents, can be a real journey to understand, because nobody writes that in a how to parent your young autistic child. It's not in any of the books really, because they don't really write books on how to successfully parent and enjoy the joy of your sensory sensitive child.
And so practitioner textbooks aren't written like that as well. No. You know, because there's an well, actually they sort of are if you read them properly, I would say. If you look at, for Dunn's model of sensory processing, they talk very much about context in there. But it's just how the occupational therapist then translates that, because people want things to be black and white.
And easy to understand.
Easy to understand. Single factor cause, consistent across every context. That makes it valid somehow, and I think when it's not like that, which of course it isn't, people can feel maybe less able to explain that. And I kind of think for teenagers that I see, I think sometimes I think you don't need to explain it to other people. If you need to make it simple for them, just make it simple for them. But I think understanding yourself, I think understanding that the nuance of it is really important. And of course, there's a bit more nuance as well, I think, which is sometimes people will do something because they really want to do it, not because it's not uncomfortable for them. They might choose that they want to go to their child's gymnastics. Think of a child thing. The child may want to go to the gymnastics event because they love gymnastics, but they realise that the applaud of the audience takes their research. That takes is hard for them. They might be able to manage it, but they know that they've got to pace themselves with that. So somebody looking at them may think, oh, they haven't got a problem.
Yeah.
No,
yeah.
they have. That's taken a lot of energy, and they've made a conscious choice that that's worth the energy.
Yeah, like going up and getting a certificate in assembly and people clapping. The reward of getting the certificate can then be negated by getting the round of applause and being looked at and having to deal with the sensory overload of being in that big busy space and all the sensations of being amongst all those people. So we're both occupational therapists. Can you describe what an occupational therapist does?
So an occupational therapist is there to help you to do the things that matter for you. So that's really about the things that you want to do or the things that you need to do. So we're very much involved in adapting the environment or adapting the task or both to best suit that person. So particularly when we're working with autistic people, we're more interested in getting that fit right between person, environment and task than we are in trying to make any changes to the person themselves.
Oh, I completely agree. I love that definition. That's such a lovely definition. I would say that in my practice, I really enjoy making the environment help work for the person and their family. And when that environment fits the family and their needs and the person and their needs, it's such a rewarding, beautiful experience, isn't it? To watch that autistic family and that autistic person just thrive. It's the best job in the world.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when I was training, there was a big focus on independence and occupational therapy, that we were there to make people independent. And thankfully, that's now much more shifting towards autonomy, which is a very different thing to independence. And autonomy is much more reflecting what's authentic, what's the element of people being able to make choices about what matters to them. And I really love that as well, when you feel that you're helping somebody to be, live their best life, not what other people are expecting or having to be the same as other people.
Oh, I love that. That's a really good definition. Fantastic. So one of the other things I wanted to ask you, Denise, is some of our families have children who have different sensory needs at home, and sometimes these can be, or even parents, because often neurodivergent children will have neurodivergent parents. And when you have clashing needs, so maybe somebody's really sensitive to noise, and if you have a young person who's going through a difficult time and they might be making a lot of noise, how would you advise or suggest ways of managing those clashing needs?
Oh, that's such an important question. And I really feel with this issue that the first place to start is acknowledging that this is hard. This is hard, and it's also very common. I think knowing that other people are going through the same, because it is common. I would say that how you described it just there is more the rule than the exception for families. And I think knowing that it's a shared issue, I think, is really helpful, because I think it's so important to be compassionate with yourself as a parent. And the reason I stress the being compassionate to ourselves as parents is because when World War III is breaking out on your landing, it's super hard. It's really hard to not see that as some kind of reflection on you as a parent.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think, I think everybody has been there. I think it's just if you have children who are autistic, you're going to be in that place even more so, because as we said, sensory processing differences are something that everybody experiences to some degree at some time. But that may be something that's quite a regular occurrence and happening a lot of the time. So acknowledging that can help you to, and it is difficult to be compassionate with yourself, but when you're in that more compassionate place, you'll be able to be more creative in thinking of solutions. It's quite hard to come up with creative solutions when you're not feeling that self-compassion. And in terms of practical, so it is difficult. So I think there are no simple solutions. But I think in terms of some practical things is creating some sensory space. And that's obviously a lot easier if you live in a mansion and you have your parents and in-laws and an army of servants. Obviously, that's going to be super easy. So I do feel that some of the advice that's given on this, you need to take with a kilo of salt, because most of us live in confined living arrangements and we're often on our own, in this situation. So you do have to be creative in how you might be able to create space. And I think if there is any opportunity to have support, then is to make use of that. So if there is an opportunity for one of your children maybe to go on a Wednesday afternoon to a friend's house, so that means that your other child can have their drum lesson at home or whatever it is that's a particular trigger, then I think it's feeling that you can reach out for that sort of thing. But also if you find there may be other ways that you can create sensory space creatively at home. And Holly, I bet you've got some really practical tips on things that you've noticed.
So we have a lot of conflicting sensory sensitivities in our house, and my goodness, has it been a journey to manage those. Interestingly, despite all my own training, it's still been a huge journey because exactly as you say, Denise, that sense of self-compassion, when you think that you should be doing better, you put yourself into a sense of immediate freeze where you don't think of the solutions. You just beat yourself up about, no, I should be doing better. I should know better. This should not be something that is getting the better of me. And also my children should listen to me. Well, you know what? Your children are going through a tough time and therefore they are telling you they are having a tough time by maybe describing that in ways that are not easy for you to hear. So meltdowns, behaviours that are showing distress, which can cause distress in yourself. So that self-compassion, I completely agree with. For me and my family, it was about creating those spaces, just like you said. So it might be very, very close spaces using noise-cancelling headphones. We didn't have a great time with ear defenders, to be honest, because they weren't effective enough. So active noise-cancelling headphones. But that is so dependent on your young person. So finding what works, starting off with the cheap solution and then working your way up. Because if your young person is somebody that is going to break something or gets really cross and throws something across the room, then you don't want to start with something that's quite expensive. But my teenager now, they know exactly what they need. So they saved up, got themselves some rather plush ear noise-cancelling headphones, and now they can't hear my other child and they're in a state of bliss. They also can't hear me shouting for them either, so they're in an extra state of bliss. The divide and conquer rule is fantastic. You know, take one out, leave the other one with somebody else.
Yeah, I think so. If that's, which is not an option available to everybody, you know, definitely not. But if it is, it's kind of you know, grabbing those opportunities for your own well-being as well. I think the parents' well-being is important in this. I think it's very easy to lose ourselves in the middle of, when other people's needs are so high, it's easy for parental well-being to be forgotten. And the other thing I was just thinking there also is the validation part of it, because sometimes things can, for example, saying about noise sensitivity, often people who have noise sensitivity are also quite noisy. And there are different, and thank you for agreeing. And there are theories about that, but it's definitely something that we do see. Just because you're sensitive to noise does not mean that you are going to be a particularly quiet person yourself. Let's put it that way. And of course, unless somebody points that out to you, it can feel very wrong when somebody's shouting at the top of their voice at somebody else to be quiet. Mm-hmm. You know, it just feels so wrong that you're going to want to go in and sort of correct that. And I think if we can kind of accept the reality of that, it's a little bit easier to be a bit more validating, because of course, if you're invalidating to somebody's experience, that can just set things off on a whole other level of distress.
Absolutely. And so I think when somebody is having a sensory sensitive experience and they're expressing to you how loud, upsetting, smelly, whatever it is, if the adult with them is not actually hearing them and trying to say, no, it's not that bad, or you just need to get over it, or just pull yourself together, it might seem like you're trying to teach that young person resilience, but it is absolutely going to backfire. Whether that's at school, whether that's at home, whether that's a grandparent or wider family member, you know, you don't have to gushingly be sort of with them through every second of it all the time, but you do have to accept that that is a very real experience for that young person. And
that's game changer. I think
it is, yeah.
As I work with teenagers, it really does become about looking to them for what's workable for them. And you want your child who's going to grow into a teenager, who's going to go into be an adult, to feel empowered and that they have agency.
Absolutely. I mean, you wouldn't shout at a baby who was crying because they were hungry to go, no, you're not hungry, and expect them to stop crying because they were hungry, you know, and it is that basic a need within every single human being. If that sensory sensation is so strong that it is causing you distress, it is real. And by teaching us to understand our senses and be able to accept and understand and verbalise and communicate wherever we can with whatever communication strategy we've got, then if we feel safe with it, we're more likely to be able to do something about it within the resources that we've got within ourselves. And if we can't do that within ourselves, then the people around us can help us to adapt our environment. We want an environment that meets our needs, where we can thrive. And I think for a lot of our children, where so much of the world is very tricky, sensory safety is so important. And that is a lot of why you see that behaviour, because they're trying to be sensorily safe.
I love that sensory safety, and actually that is, of course, the other big element is the having really been able to use your sensory comforts, your sensory joys, your sensory fascinations, your sensory glimmers, the things that trigger safety, cue safety for you. You know, those are, I think quite often we get very focused on looking for things being wrong, but there's also, we can forget to really home in on and really maximise those sensory strengths that are just so important.
Absolutely. So those sensory safety and sensory joy elements, Denise, just tell me a little bit more about that before we finish off.
Oh, well, the term sensory glimmer, I don't know who to credit it to, but I mean, glimmers are something that don't have to be sensory, but I think it's really nice to put it together with sensory glimmer. And those are things that cue you for safety, and the opposite to a trigger, which kind of cues you for threat and danger. And so sensory comforts, you can have comfort from any of your senses, so not forgetting your sense of movement, being able to stand to work or being able to, pace at the back of the classroom, or being able to have your fidget toy to be able to comfort yourself with smells that you like, or a special plush blanket that feels just right, or a plush toy that might be exactly the right smell and exactly the right tactile sensation. And being able to have that in a way that feels right for you, and being in touch with that as well. It takes, I kind of feel my job is often to just help young people to be in touch with what they're, or not to be, but kind of get granular about it, really understand the detail, the exact right sensory comfort, not sort of saying, for example, you're somebody who likes tactile sensation, therefore you should like this fidget toy.
Yeah.
Where it's what is it? What is the exact tactile sensation that works for that person? And I love that bit, of really trying to get into the detail of that, and trying to really help people to get that right.
Yeah, it's really powerful, isn't it? Especially when it unlocks so many things for that young person, whether that's their concentration so that they can do something that they really want to do, or that it makes them feel so relaxed and happy that it brings about a sense of well-being that they didn't have before, and a sense of mental health and well-being that just creates a balance for them that they need to build the rest of their life on, that then will have an impact on the rest of their family, because their family will feel better and happier.
It's very affirming.
Yeah, affirming is the right word. And then it leads the person to find another sensory joy and another sensory joy, and really establish themselves as that sensory being, which I think for non-autistic people, we get to do all the time with music, with art, with sports, with activity.
Yeah, much easier.
But for autistic people, it's always called a repetitive behaviour, or a sensory interest, or something to be, I don't know, called a symptom, whereas, it's not. It's just part of being a human being. Well, I think we might have finished off there, Denise, and thank you so much for your time, and I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I could speak to you all day about all things sensory and occupational therapy based.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you everyone for listening, and join us again for more podcasts in this series.
You've been listening to the Autism Central podcast. Find out more about our programme for parents and carers of autistic people at autismcentral.org.uk. Information related to strategies and approaches discussed in the Autism Central podcast is based on guests' personal perspectives and experiences, and does not constitute advice or endorsement from the Autism Central programme. Autism Central would encourage listeners to do their own research and make informed decisions about any strategies or equipment mentioned in this podcast. Any advice or suggestions given by a guest do not replace or substitute advice received from direct consultation with a qualified professional. The Autism Central podcast is produced by Autism Central and is the copyright of NHS England. All rights reserved.